Good morning. So, my agenda today is to step you through a consideration of what leads us to the present state of the affairs in the philosophy of biology that I will argue is a revolutionary state. I will take you just briefly through some understanding of empirical science just to set the scene, some pre-Darwinian models lead up to the Darwinian paradigm, and then take you to where we are at present. Before we do that, however, I wanted to begin with at least my memorial for Father Artigas. I first met Father Artigas during 2 summer institutes at the Jacques Maritain Center at the Notre Dame, Thomistic institutes that Ralph McInerney organized. And he invited us those 2 summers to be together as scientists and Thomistic philosophers to confront the 2 issues. And some of you, in fact, Bill, some of Marie, some of you were there for these 2 institutes. And here's the group picture from, I think, that 2nd summer we were together. And for those of you who can't see, there's Father Artigas standing next to Ralph McInerney. Some of the other people in this picture include Father Martinez, there you are, Father Monsignor Clavel, Father Sanguinetti. And what was really interesting for me during that summer is I would take these morning walks and jogs around the 2 lakes at Notre Dame, Lake Mary's Lake and St. Joseph's Lake. And on those morning walks, I would encounter Father Martinez and Father Sanguinetti, Monsignor Clavel, and Father Artigas doing their morning walks. So we took to walking together, if you remember. And it was phenomenal. We had at least English in common, because I spoke no other language. But there were these jokes being told. And the phenomenal thing was Mariano's sense of humor. He would tell these jokes with a totally deadpan face. And then this smile would break out as I got the joke, you know. It was just delightful. And we did that, if I remember, for 2 summers in a row. It was a wonderful time. I have great memories of our mornings together in Notre Dame. Anyway, that's Father Mariano. Let's begin with a little bit of consideration of what we call empirical science. And I'm going to speak today not so much as a philosopher of science, but more as a practitioner of empirical science, somebody who actually has, in the laboratory, tried to follow this particular line. So I don't want to confuse it with empiricism itself, but want to call it more a methodological approach. It's something that has a number of times, something that we do. We take evidence from observations, literally evidence from our senses, and we use those as a way of gaining an understanding of the natural world. So we call this the scientific method. There are many formulations of the scientific method. My favorite, because it's the kind that I did and I do in the laboratory, is I make observations, the data collection stage. I'm actually making observations of the natural world. I use those observations to begin constructing a hypothesis. That's the model building stage, the models we talked about yesterday. I then design experiments that are the model testing phase, where I'm going to kind of see if the model actually survives organized observation. And then, based on that, I'll reformulate the hypothesis. This is where I'm tuning and revising the model. And then finally, if I'm fortunate enough to have done enough of this, I come to have a theory or law, which is where I actually build a model that can be utilized by my discipline. That's sort of the process that I go through in working in the laboratory. And notice it begins with this interaction with the natural world through the evidence of senses. And this is a method that goes back in time, of course, to the father of biology, Aristotle, who Marie George will talk about a little bit more in the next session, where he understood knowledge as gained from the sense experience to be the key interaction he had with the natural world. As his thought came down, people like Ibn Sina in the Muslim world became true empiricists. That is, thought that the only knowledge we have is that gained from experience, tabula rasa kind of approach. But that isn't really the scientific approach that I want to talk about. It isn't that kind of empiricism that I think a scientist a practicing scientist actually does. We're more, in fact, like who use that approach to study things. And that's what we do, is use the method. And so Thomas was taking an empirical approach to philosophy and theology, the approach he learned from his great mentor, Albert the Great. So we observe, we interact with the natural world mainly through our senses. What do they tell us? How does it look? How does it feel? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it sound like? All of these things are observations that all of us as humans make on our planet. But science is a particular kind of observation, a critical observation, using a particular method. Our initial interactions with the natural world are, of course, through the senses directly. But as we move into the age of instrumentation, we find that we now have intervening between our senses and the thing observed something like an instrument. So rather than just seeing the night sky, we now look at the night sky through the Hubble telescope, or we observe rocks using microscopes, or we observe cells using electron microscopes. We even get data that doesn't look anything like we imagine the thing itself observes. Display of DNA sequence data from a modern rapid sequencer. So we have these interventions between ourselves and the thing observed. What that leads to is the concept that we call theory-laden data. I don't mean to make this sound as though science is relativistic and that theories and the like are based on data that are relative. What I mean to suggest is that the models we build are tentative models, at best approximations, because they're based on how we collect the observations. This is really obvious, I think, for instrumental observations, but also applies to even the sense observations we make. And let me give you an example. For instance, when an early observer of the night sky is collecting data about the movement of stars and planets and charting those to build models of the universe, a cosmological model such as Ptolemy's or Copernicus's, he or she is using sense observation, but notice is collecting data that is amenable to the instrument in use, that is the human eye. Okay? So even when lenses are enveloped and invented and Galileo begins to collect data with a telescope, he is still using the same theory. That is, that what he needs to observe are things that emit visible light. So even a modern telescope uses exactly the same theoretical framework. Now what this does is filter the data through this very narrow spectrum of just what is present in the visible spectrum, leaving out all of the rest of the emitted radiation, such that if that's all you used, and if you assumed that's all there was to see, you'd be missing things like radio sources, for instance, which are emitting somewhere outside of this spectrum, over here. In fact, if you assume that everything in the universe to be observed are only things that emit in this electromagnetic spectrum, you'd be missing dark matter. Okay? So the theory of observing here is laden with the theory of what is to be observed. And I can give other examples in discussion of exactly what I mean. Now this again is not to say that it's relativistic, only that the models we tend to build and work with are therefore approximations. A critical realist approach, in other words, to how we do our actual experiments. We make models of nature that are approximations, we think, of what actually is there. A realist approach, but with criticism. All right, now given that as our kind of observational backdrop, let's talk a little bit about Father Artigas' proposal that there are presuppositions upon which this activity is based. And I very much like his idea of couching this as material to be considered that underlies what I do in the laboratory. So for instance, as we know, we've already talked about, he said, the universe is ordered. That's a presupposition, an ontological presupposition. He then argued that the human mind is capable of comprehending that order. That's an epistemological presupposition. And then he said that, in fact, that activity, that goal-directed activity, has value for us. We do it because it has value. So there's kind of an ethical presupposition about what we do. And those three things for me actually spoke volumes about what it is to go into a laboratory and do work. It's actually, if you think about it, exactly why I would get up in the morning and go do this. Otherwise, there'd be no point. If these things weren't true, there'd be absolutely no point of doing it. So this is a very important observation that I think many working scientists don't actually appreciate, but literally experience each day of their lives, that this is the reason we do it. So thinking about that, then I wanted to couch that along with a series of looks at how the scientific enterprise actually proceeds, and beginning with Karl Popper and Michael Polanyi's understanding of the structure of science, how we proceed as scientists that Popper offered, and then Polanyi's understanding that sort of mirrors Artigas' idea that we have a tacit understanding of our world. We have an interaction with our world that is more or less unspoken. that are these presuppositions about it. And coming on that, we with two kinds of models of how the progress of science takes place. First of all, there's the Kuhnian model. He ordered that things go along just fine in a discipline where there's a paradigm that sort of organizes the research in that discipline rise until there's a revolutionary change, which is his model. He's accused, of course, of being relativistic, and I don't take it in that sense. I take it in the sense that these are just models that were approximations that ultimately need to be dealt with, even to be overturned if necessary, because they no longer serve the function of being explanatory for the field and predictive for future work. But his proposal was generating controversy in the sense that it was this kind of massive upheaval idea, and everybody didn't agree with him. And so the other kind of proposal came from Lakatos and his research programs, where he was trying to reconcile some of this Kuhnian notion of upheaval and said, no, research actually progresses as a program where there are auxiliary hypotheses being generated, and if the program is progressive, then the auxiliary hypotheses keep the program growing. If it's degenerative, then they don't serve that function and the program tends to die and a new one arises. So my question for us will be, where is biology now? Are we going through a revolution that's as dramatic as the Kuhnian one, or are we more like Lakatos's research programs? And I'll lead you up to a consideration of that. And you'll notice at the end I'm not going to make a conclusion because I think we're in the middle of this revolutionary change, and I think the answer actually isn't clear yet, but I'll try to make a case for both possibilities. Okay, so why am I saying this is revolutionary at this point? First of all, I'm going to argue that the presuppositions that form this tacit understanding about empirical science are actually, as I said, why we do the work that we do. We walk into the laboratory with that in mind, at least as part of our underlying assumption. We make observations. This is how we carry out that activity that act out those presuppositions. The observations lead to these constructions of explanatory models with which we can work. The data that we obtain, though, are theory-laden, obviously, that the observations we make depend on what we are taking in as the theory to make those. And therefore, the models are incomplete, only incomplete descriptions of that reality. And that further data acquisition is going to ultimately lead to revisions of the models or construction of new models. And then the final point I'll try to argue is that these new models may lead to essential metaphysical shifts in the discipline. That's where I think we're at right now in biology, and I'll try to lead you to that understanding. Now, biology before Darwin, of course, was a very different kind of science. In fact, leading up to Darwin, we were really just an observational discipline without a lot of theory, without a lot of real basis in what a physicist would call science. The pre-Darwinian ideas about species, for instance, were either the Greek that there was an eternity of the world and therefore an eternity of these forms, either ideal forms in the Platonic sense or species, whatever that means in the Aristotelian sense. Of course, in the Genesis tradition that was part of the Abrahamic religions, the world had a beginning in time, and that beginning included the creation of all that exists in the living world in creation of natural kind. So both were an idea that these things were created as we currently see them. These were the notions we had in the biological world. And in fact, these two understandings of the world collide in the Middle Ages. And I just want to take a little aside to see what happened when this Greek understanding with the Abrahamic traditions. Ibn Rashid and others in the Muslim world were looking at this story and asking, could the world be both as the Greeks imagined it, eternal, and as the scriptures imagined it, created? Did it have a beginning in time? And Ibn Rashid concluded that, in fact, religion would take a back seat to reason in this case. So his conclusion was that the beginning of the world was something to be considered as a rational person. The eternity of the world, as Aristotle had claimed, would be what a rational person would conclude and would be valued over the faith experience of a beginning. In fact, he argues, I think, that the idea of a beginning is something you gave to the masses because they couldn't comprehend the eternity of Aristotle. They couldn't actually hold that, so you gave them the metaphor of having a beginning. When this comes into the intellectual community in Paris, at the time of St. Thomas, Sige of Brabant and the Latin Averroists said, well, we're going to hold both of these as true. We're basically going to hold the Aristotelian tradition of the eternity of the world as true when we're being rationalists. But then when we go to church, we'll hold that there's a beginning to the world and be in the Genesis tradition. Hold both as true, but independently, sort of the non-overlapping magisteria of the day. And of course, the alternative to that was St. Bonaventure, and who Thomas called the murmurers, who said, no, 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 no. The Averroist tradition is a slap in the face to Genesis. It's an abomination to revealed Scripture, and so we need to throw that out. So this became kind of one of the earliest science-religion controversies. Here were the scientists of the day, the Latin Averroists, saying, we have to be rationalist and think like Aristotle. Here was St. Bonaventure saying, if it conflicts with Scripture, toss it. The ultimate kind of creationist argument of today. And into this, of course, stepped our brother Thomas and wrote De Aeternitatis Mundi, in which he said, you know, you guys are both wrong. You can actually think about it both ways. If God is the God we think he is, then he could actually create an eternal world. And he makes a very cogent argument in that for how you can think that through, going all the way back to Augustine and others to say that they weren't worried about this as impossible, so why should you be worried about this as impossible? Pretty much casting himself as an early theistic evolutionist, if you will, standing in the middle, trying to make peace with both sides. He suffered the same fate that most of us in theistic evolution do, being bombarded by both sides as being antithetical to their position, and ultimately, we know, suffered condemnation in Paris. An interesting example of an attempt to make peace between these supposedly warring sides. You can picture the cover of New in Paris, of course, saying the creation wars, doing the same thing. So with that, though, we get this move towards the present, in which still the image that we have biologically is of everything being created initially as we see it. So even Carl Linné and his great classification system, published in 1735, System Naturae, in which he now moves towards a kind of quantification in biology where we get a scheme of classification, a kind of hierarchical ordering of life, from domains all the way down to the lowest level of species. Even that Linnaean scheme assumes that the species are unchanging. Linnaeus is actually looking for what he defines as ideal types. He realizes that there are variations when you look at living things. They don't all look exactly alike, so he's actually seeking for each species the ideal type, the prototypical species, because he assumes these are the way they were created originally. Okay? This is the standard kind of model leading up to Darwin. Now, didn't actually come up with this entire scheme fresh out of nowhere. He had a lot of influences that led to this. One of his primary influences, of course, is William Paley, the author of theory, with which Darwin was intimately familiar. He, as a student at Oxford, he said, virtually memorized this text. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould will argue with you that in many ways, Origin of Species is an answer to natural theology. Gould argues that it's actually constructed along the same lines as the book Natural Theology, that his arguments follow the same order as Paley's arguments. So Darwin was influenced throughout his entire life by reading Paley's book. Another big influence on his life was his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who wrote 2 generations before Darwin, this book, Zoonomia, and Darwin actually wrote a biography of his grandfather in which he reviewed all of his work. And in this book, The Laws of Organic Life, very near the end of it, Erasmus Darwin has a paragraph in which he says, wouldn't it be wonderful if we eventually found that all living things descended from some common ancestor? Wouldn't that be an amazing thing? And he actually talks in that paragraph about something he calls a filament of life, threading through the generations. And when I read that, I immediately thought, of course, of DNA as a filament of life. It's an actually beautiful statement that presages that whole notion of a DNA molecule being involved in this. So here was another influence on him that I think he felt pretty dramatically. Of course, Charles Lyell, the great geologist who was a contemporary of Darwin, a great influence on him. All of his notes into book form. John Murray, the publisher here in London, was Lyell's publisher, and that's who he introduced him to get Origin of Species published, arranged the talk with he and Wallace and all that. Darwin took this book with him on the voyage on the Beagle and read the first volume, at least, of Principles of Geology, and of course got from that the whole idea of deep time and the structure of the geological world that was then current. And Lyell was its chief proponent at the time. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was another great influence. Gould argues that Lamarck, for all of the criticisms people in the modern world have about him, inherit, was in fact the first great evolutionist, that he had constructed a very coherent theory with lots of supporting evidence, to which Darwin had to respond in Origin of Species. And Darwin's attempt was in fact pushed by what Lamarck had done. I'll come back to Lamarck a little bit later because you'll see that he's come back to haunt Darwin in this Year of Darwin. And we'll see how that happens. And then finally, of course, Thomas Malthus and his essay on the principles of population was the final key that Darwin needed to bring together his proposal. Because the idea that population outstrips resources, that Malthus said that populations are growing at a geometric rate where resources are increasing at an arithmetic rate, was a key event in Darwin's understanding of how natural selection would actually work to enhance those traits in a population which increased the likelihood of their survival as replicators. So that was the final piece in this that are present in Origin. Hypothesis, everything being created in the form we see it. No, things all descended from a common ancestral type. That this took place by a force he called natural selection in literal comparison to artificial selection, which we do in agronomy and agriculture when we pick a species for its traits, that the natural world does that also. That this is a selection based on the variation, modification, and adaptation of species that are undergoing change. That all of this is happening with the limited resource environment of Malthus, and therefore only those with the traits that would best allow them to pass their information on to the next generation, only those traits would be allowed. He looked at this as something that happened over deep time, so it's a gradual change over deep time. He was actually drawing these kinds of family trees, or trees of life, as we now call them. Here's the early one from his notes in 1842. Here's the one that was published in Origin of Species. And we can see his idea that there are extinctions. There are lines of descent which suddenly terminate. And he knew this from the fossil record. So extinctions became a large part of his model. And he was defining species here morphologically. He wrestled with the species definition. How do you define a species? And he knew that the line between a species and just variants of the same species was a very narrow and very nebulous one. He didn't actually understand where you make that line, but nonetheless he struggled with doing it morphologically. And we'll see how that definition has changed over the 150 years since the publication of Origin. So this was his bold hypothesis. I want to argue that if you were a person walking down Marylebone Street 150 years ago in that November, and you happened to pick up this book and you didn't know much else about it, started reading it, it would have shocked you. Because your concept before that would have been, no, everything was created in the form I see it. And here's this man saying everything descended from a common ancestor by a series of modifications and selections. This would have been a rather shocking hypothesis for you to swallow. So it was a revolutionary idea, just scientifically. Never mind the social and theological overlays that were put on it afterwards. Just the science itself would have been a bold and shocking hypothesis compared to what Carl Linné thought. Now, his scientific reception, we all know of his theological reception, but his scientific reception was a little different. Most scientists accepted the idea that evolution did occur. It was current in the theme. It had been written by Lamarck. It had been written by Chambers. Even Spencer had a version of evolution in some of his books. So this wasn't an unusual idea. But the problem was his mechanism didn't convince everyone. He argued that natural selection was a force. But of course, he had nothing on which it would act. He didn't really know what this force acted on. So a physicist would object to calling it a force. It had no object on which it acted. And he had no clear idea of how inheritance took place. In fact, the London professor of engineering, Fleming Jenkin, wrote a major critique of origin based on the fact that Darwin, as everyone else at the time believed, blending was the model of inheritance, not Mendelian inheritance as we know. Even though Mendel was doing his work at the same time, as we all know historically, nobody read that. It wasn't recovered until the beginning of the 20th century. So here was Darwin locked in this issue where he was arguing that traits are inherited, but inheritance was blending. So Jenkins said, well, then any positive trait would eventually be diluted out by blending of all the parental traits. There would be no way you could select it. Over time, it would just be diluted. So Darwin's only argument against that, which he published in, I think, the 5th edition, was to fall back on Lamarck and say, well, if the entire population acquired some trait, it would be passed on to the next generation, and that would be selected. So he actually went to acquired characteristics inheritance as a defense against the Jenkin argument. If he knew about men, he would have had to do that, of course. So in that environment, then, by the end of the century, Darwin's hypothesis, even though it has an effect in the sense that we now accept the evolutionary model, we still don't know a mechanism. We still don't have an agreement, I should say, on the mechanism. And it isn't until near the middle of the 20th century that the synthesis of Darwin's ideas, along with Mendelian genetics, which has been recovered and now elaborated in the beginning of the 20th century, and then it's the understanding that this also applies to populations. The whole Hardy-Weinberg of equilibrium story that comes out by the early part of the 20th century, all that is put together in what Julian Huxley called the modern synthesis and what we now call the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, so that our understanding of genetics is that small changes in the genome, called mutations, within a large population gradually accumulate and then become the target or the substrate for this force called natural selection. Okay, so we put together Darwin and Mendel, and that makes now a cogent theoretical framework that at this point becomes the overarching paradigm for biology. By 1942, with the publication of Huxley's proposal for the modern synthesis, we now have a paradigm that we can say all of biology will be subsumed under as we move forward in the age of the modern age of biology in the past and present century. Still the species problem. Kinds, according to from Aristotle to Linné, were unchanging. Whatever we were calling a species was something that was seen as created originally. For Darwin, as I said, there was this morphological definition which he wrestled with. How do I actually tell something is a different species versus just a variant of the one before it in the lineage? So that problem, it persisted. But now in the Neo-Darwinian view, we have genetic and reproductive definitions to fall back on. So we can say now a species is going to be defined as happening when two groups are reproductively isolated and can no longer interbreed. So we'll make a reproductive definition that gets us away from looking at fine details of morphology. Because we'll just say these two can't breed, so therefore they're defined as different species. They're isolated reproductively and therefore genetically. So we see we've moved that definition now into the paradigm. The species definition is now subsumed into the paradigm itself. All right. Then I call this section the short, happy life of molecular biology. When I first started talking about the end of molecular biology to my colleagues in my department of molecular biology, well, you know, people were looking at me like I was crazy. I still have NIH grants. What are you talking about? So, but let me make the case that molecular biology essentially almost ended, and perhaps even did in some sense. So let's talk a little bit about its history, the two golden ages, and where we are now, and this paradigm in crisis idea. We began with somebody like Ernst Schrödinger, who in 1944 wrote this little book he called What is Life, in which he argued that physicists ought to be interested in biology, because in biology there are things like genes which survived intact over generational changes, so much so that he imagined they must be subject to some other physical laws than the ones of thermodynamics. There must be some new physical law to be discovered by looking at genes. And Max Delbruck, another physicist who was on the same track, but unlike Schrödinger, who did this theoretically and gave lectures in Dublin about this during his stay there, Delbruck actually began working on this and came to the United States and founded what began to be called the phage group, because Delbruck chose, along with others, to very simple, I'll use organisms here in quotes, viruses of bacteria called bacteriophage, as a simple system. Approaching this as a physicist would, let's look at the simplest system we can. So convinced everybody to work on the same system of bacteriophage. Formed around him a research group at the California and the Long Island at the Cold Spring Harbor group, Cold Spring Harbor. So physicists began tackling biology in the 1940s and into the 50s, and out of this, very early seminal achievements came. For instance, Delbruck and Luria published a major paper on the nature of mutation that indicated the statistical nature of mutation. Of course, the famous Hershey-Chase experiment that confirmed the earlier Avery work with DNA as the genetic material. And coming out of this whole was, in fact, the DNA structure, not out of the phage group itself, but out of the larger community of molecular biology, the Watson, Crick, Wilson, and Franklin work on DNA here in Britain. As this develops then, the philosophical position of biology changes. What was methodological reductionism, taking it apart down to the molecules like DNA, moves towards a metaphysical reductionism, the assumption that that's what there is to see about life, the chemistry and physics of life. And of course, the physicists are bringing that bias in with them as they come to make these observations in biology. So what we're seeing are the molecules that are important, and that's really what there is to see. Okay, so that ontology begins to form itself and capture the field. And in fact, this first golden age of biology, from about the late 40s up until the end of the decade of the 50s into the early 60s, makes rapid progress at building molecular models of genes. We understand about DNA replication, we understand about making RNA out of DNA, about protein synthesis, all these things, so much so that Francis Crick, it falls to him eventually in 1968 to publish this overriding thematic argument, which he calls at the time the central dogma of molecular biology, in which he said all information flow in biology goes DNA to DNA, DNA replication, from DNA to RNA, transcription, and from RNA to protein, translation. He uses dogma at the time in a way that he eventually has to apply it the way it sounded, but he certainly did at the time. This dream of a humanistic religion, a secular humanism, come true, because now we have a trinity to hold up, the DNA, RNA, and protein, in place of the Christian Trinity, in a sense. And so his use of the word dogma, I think, at the time was very conscious, given the culture that was going on in the early molecular biological days. Now, at this point in my story, you'll notice that even though I fulfilled the primary directive of our workshop by speaking of Father Artigas' work, I have not yet fulfilled the subtext of our workshop. So I want to do that now by raising Richard Dawkins up for you, which has become, as you know, the subtext. And I want to say that at this point, much so that evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins begin to use the molecular paradigm as the central principle of evolution. Thus, the selfish gene becomes the target of evolutionary natural selection. Not populations any longer, not even individuals in populations, but their replicating DNA, having its thrust to be passed on to the next generation. So we are nothing more than containers for these avidly replicating molecules, according to Richard's model. So notice here, I'm not critiquing any of his theology or philosophy. I'm simply using him to point out that he's not a molecular biologist, but he assumes in his model this paradigm, which becomes now the predominant one. So much so that Carl Woese has argued that this took over all of biology and chased out all other kinds of views of organisms by the middle of the 20th century. Became the only way for people in any field of biology to think about biology is through the molecular lens. Okay? So we became then the overriding paradigm. And it's in this field that I grew up, right about the time of the end of that first golden age. I was coming in as a graduate student. And so this is the biology I learned. Biology is thought of as DNA and everything that DNA does. The second golden age came a little bit later. In the 60s and into the 70s, biology, well, Jacob Monod thought that it was all done. He'd done the operon model, and he said, what's true for E. coli is true for an elephant. And pretty much thought, we figured it all out. But when we started looking at higher structures, eukaryotic cells instead of just bacteria, we found out there were some great differences. So we spent the decade of the 70s and like really refining our look at various kinds of biology, but all with the same general paradigm. And during that time, our technology got to be incredibly detailed. We could do amazing things like sequence DNA. We could actually take apart that molecule and learn the linear array of bases in it. So molecular techniques were being widely used in other areas. Everybody was doing DNA sequencing after a while, or cloning, or all these technological advances that allowed us to peek into the details of our molecules. So much so that these genetic criteria now place, instead of reproductive isolation, we talk about protein comparisons and genomic comparisons and even molecular cladistics. This is a tree of life that you can find on the web that's entirely based on genomics. It never even references an organism. Okay, it's all based on gene sequences, this tree of life. So we see that the entire paradigm now even goes to the species definition of defining it by molecular biology. Then we come to the ultimate project for molecular biology, sequencing the human genome. This is our first attempt at big science. Physics had already done this with colliders and the like, and so we now had our attempt at getting some big money and doing this. The Department of Energy came to the biologist and said, if we gave you all the money in the world, would you sequence the human genome? And we thought about it for, a microsecond and said, sure. Yeah. Later, it's co-funded with NIH. The rapid sequencing technology leads to the ability to do this. We actually get this great leap forward by focusing only on the regions of the genome that are made actually into proteins, so-called express sequences. And by February of 2001, the draft sequence is published. Here's the science cover from that April. It was also published in Nature at the same time. So now, were we in danger of becoming a technique provider rather than a discipline? Did we have any more questions to answer? A discipline needs questions. You have to be able to ask questions and then answer them. But here we were. We've sequenced the human genome. What's left to do? We're done. We're finished. We can just now happily provide sequences to everyone. But it turned out it was more interesting than that, because this just bring us to the sequence end. It actually brought us up against a wall, a literal wall of information. Reductionism, remember, is the philosophical orientation of the project. The first director was Jim Watson, whose idea was once we sequence the chromosome of the human, we know exactly what it means to be a human being. Question answered. Okay? 2 problems. Here's a slide from the early project days. DNA codes for 80,000 different proteins, it says. Of course, it says for humans. The number was greater than 80. In Jim's mind, it was something like 120,000 different genes. When the sequence was published in 2001, we found out we only have about 25,000. Actually, it's downgraded now to about 20,000. Even worse, that's the same number as the worm or the fruit fly. It's not what makes us human. In that issue of April 2001, people immediately realized the problem, and there was a nice hand-waving paper in there by somebody who said, well, if you just think about it as the number, it looks kind of weird, but if we multiply it by a couple of factors and plot it on a log-log scale, we can see that it was total hand-waving. I mean, it's totally like, okay, we have a real problem here. The number of genes is not what makes us human. An even worse problem occurred when people looked at the databases, and this is a very simple database, the yeast genome, which is much less than ours in terms of numbers. And people realized that even the definition of the word gene was in question, because it depended on how you addressed the database, what you told the computer to look for when you were counting genes. And the authors of this particular paper concluded that they said for the foreseeable future, the concept of the gene is in question. So here we not only have a wall of data colliding with who we are, but we actually have it colliding with what we say is our central paradigm, the gene and the sequence of DNA. So molecular biology at that point is in definite crisis. We don't know what to do, and this is only 8 years ago. Okay? And come a number of things. One thing is the new tool of network and systems biology. This had been developing in physics. It had been developing in the social sciences. The work of Stanley Milgram and 6 degrees of separation and all of that had talked about these networks that especially are scale-free, or what are called colloquially small world networks. And people realized that it wasn't the genes that were important, but it's what they produce, the proteins. And even they're not important. What's really important is how they interact. And so we got these massive array techniques of measuring all possible interactions in a genome, all the products of it, and plotting it as what are called now interactomes. We realized these things have what are called emergent properties. That is, the whole is not equal to tool. Now, instead of doing DNA sequence, we plot interactomes like this. Or does this mean a real philosophical reductionistic? Now it's holistic. It's 180 degrees shifted in what we're doing. We're thinking of emergent properties. In addition to that, the standard model is being assaulted in a number of ways. For instance, we realize that rather than these trees of life in which genes are passed vertically from generation, also what are called horizontal transfers, where genes go from one lineage to another directly within the same generation. And we always knew this could happen in bacteria. This was standard in the laboratory. So talking about species in bacteria is actually a very difficult thing because of this. But now we actually see it happening in eukaryotic species. And here's a paper from 2008 talking about horizontal transfer in eukaryotic evolution, where we can see evidence of these major transfers that are endosymbiotic from one line to another in the lineage of eukaryotes, and some will even argue that as we speak. There are examples of this in plant world and a lot of lower eukaryotes where there are transfers going on currently that we can actually measure. So this blurs the species definition. In fact, Carl Woese in a paper in 2007 argued that the whole problem of species in evolutionary theory is at issue now because of horizontal gene transfer. Not only that, but suddenly Lamarck raises his specter again. In this year of Darwin, the issue of was Lamarck actually correct in some sense. Example of if the female, this is the water flea with and without this carapace on it, and if the female water flea lives in an environment without predation, she produces descendants that without that carapace on it. If she lives in an environment with predation, she produces descendants that look like this. She acquires the ability to produce these descendants by what is called epigenetics, which has to do with modifications of her DNA by adding methyl groups. So some would argue that this is Lamarckian, that this is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Of course, there's a big attempt in the biological blogosphere now to shoot that down by saying, oh, no, no, no. She evolved by strictly be able to do, even though the passage of traits on is somewhat this acquired character. This is not an isolated example. We even do this in methylation ourselves. We don't know what it do this imprinting ourselves. And so, oh no, not another paradigm shift. Where now biology, or to echo an inspiration for my title, is it tomorrow or just the end of time, as Jimi Hendrix said. I'll make two arguments. One, we are witnessing what Lakatos described as a progressive research program with the development of auxiliary hypotheses. That's all that's going on. So we have the incorporation of new observations into the overarching paradigm by adjusting the models. Epigenetics could be seen as that. No, no, it's not Lamarckian. It's simply a Darwinian mechanism that evolved to allow this to be able to happen in these specialized cases. Or horizontal gene transfer is subsumed into the definition by adjusting the species definition to include horizontal as in addition to vertical transfer of information. So we're adjusting the model. That's one possibility. Argument two, we're witnessing a true Kuhnian kind of paradigm shift where the anomalies are building up that are not accounted for by the current paradigm. And I'll argue that network biology is leading in that direction because it results in a 180-degree philosophical shift in perspective. There are biologists out there who are doing interactomes and publishing holistic models of organisms and don't actually realize that they're doing this in a different philosophical setting. There are a couple who do. Lee Hood is one in Seattle who writes now his papers about yeast, saying one cannot understand the yeast cell by only understanding the sum of the molecules. One has to look at it as a holistic emergent property. Now the question Marie-George and I argued earlier is whether this is truly a philosophical shift or just another example of materialism. That's to be seen. To be honest, I'd say that this story is still in process to be continued, I'm going to argue, in the next generation of biologists who take up the cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for discussion questions. Yes, please. We have to have the microphone.
Ah.
Steve Fuller.
Okay. Is it fine?
It's on.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. Very stimulating talk. There are some historical details I might quibble with you about, but I don't want to do that here. I have two questions, and I'll try to be brief, and you can deal with them as you will. Mm-hmm. But I think they're quite relevant to what we're talking about here. The first one relates to the stuff that you've brought up toward the end of the talk, and this has to do with all of these changes that are taking place within biology. So the prominence of horizontal gene transfer, the shift to a sort of genomic definition of species from a morphological definition, and all these Lamarckian effects that you've talked about at the very end. And so the first question is, what's the relevance of Darwin anymore in this? Right? There's a sense in which, because the kind of paradigm shift you're talking about is from the molecular biology-centered view from, you know, let's say, in a way, the prehistory of it would be Mendel, and then moving into DNA and Jacob Monod and all the rest after that. But it's not clear what Darwin's relevance is to that anymore, okay, especially given all these other kinds of shifts taking place. And of course, people like Lamarck and that whole French tradition of evolution, Buffon and so forth, had a much more loose view of species to begin with.
Yes.
Right? So there's a sense in which, you know, Darwin has some baggage there that in a sense is holding things back also. Okay? That's the first point. The second point goes back to the very beginning of your talk, and it's very interesting in this conference where we're talking about science and religion. I think you're the first one to actually invoke Muslim thinkers.
Yes.
Okay, and in a way, this might be the more controversial point, because you brought in Avicenna at the very beginning and say, you know, Avicenna has this kind of tabula rasa view and so forth about knowledge, and that's wrong, because in fact we are model makers in all this. Now, as I've been writing about this science and religion things, I've been very much kind of an ecumenicalist about Abrahamic religions, and basically saying they're all pro-science in the same sense. And one of the things that I get brought up to me is, in fact, the differences between Islam and Christianity. And in a sense, I think you're sort of touching on this in an indirect way. Because in terms of the relationship of human beings to God with regard to the sacred scripture, right, Muhammad is a receptacle. Okay, whereas the biblical authors are actually active agents who can, in principle, misunderstand God, and that's why, in a sense, there's so much allowance of controversy within Christianity, in a sense, because there's a kind of recognition of the imperfection of the people who actually wrote the Bible, whereas in the Quran, that's, you know, Muhammad's supposed to be a vehicle, and so even if you're translating the Quran into another language, you know, there's a sense in which, no, the language of God is, you know, this Arabic, right? I mean, and the business about science as being tabula rasa is very much in a similar vein, right? That we're receptacles that kind of receive the truth and so forth. Whereas the other version, the Christian version, is one where we're actually active agents
of the truth.
Right, exactly. And that we can make mistakes and that we can correct ourselves and so forth. And so I think this has some quite, you know, profound implications in a way, as in terms of the degree of, you know, pro-science and so forth. Especially, you know, in terms of, you know, what kind of religious orientation actually promotes people to do science. And it does seem to give the edge to Christianity over Islam. Okay, given the relationship between human beings and God vis-a-vis the sacred scriptures as a kind of model of knowledge.
Right.
Okay, and I'm just wondering, given that you are the one who has brought up Islam formally on this, and you brought it up in a way that kind of showed the deficiency of Islam, at least indirectly. I'm wondering what your view is, because I do think this is kind of a very important issue, especially in these times.
Right. So let me start with the first, which is a little bit easier, I think, to tackle. Where is Darwin in all of this? And it's clear that the basic structure that Darwin laid down for us, I think, has changed a lot over time. Obviously, the modern synthesis was already a major shift, because it now added an inheritance model. It rescued the Darwinian model, but nonetheless, Darwin's basic hypothesis of descent with modification over deep time with the force of natural selection acting on these variants still is in force for us. In other words, as Dobzhansky said, you can't understand biology except through the lens of this model. And so when we look and see, for instance, in the molecular sense, that we can make a tree of life with genomes, we understand that in the Darwinian sense, which means that these genomes are all related by basically the same set of processes. We all replicate DNA the same way. None of us do it differently. And we understand that as the descent from a common ancestor that, in some sense, evolved to replicate DNA that way. So the Darwinian strain is still strong. We didn't acquire the ability to do that in the Lamarckian sense. We acquired it in the Darwinian sense. So I think even with this attack, and even with Woolsey saying we have to throw out Darwin's definition of species and even maybe the whole species concept, we still maintain the idea of that descent. So in this year of Darwin, it's appropriate, I think, to celebrate still that influence. But coming back to the second point, which I think you're right is a bigger issue, I'm not a big scholar of that particular era, but I like to always mention Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina in this vein because we know historically, I'm sure you would agree, that it's through them that we get this back to the West.
Yeah.
But your point is well taken in that their influence within their own culture was very limited in time. Move to make Aristotelian science, we'll call it, that material be a part of Muslim culture was greatly shot. And in talking to Muslim colleagues about this over the years discussion, they bemoan that fact. They argue that where the West opened up to this and we got science out of it, the Muslim world shut down and retreated into that literally shunned that. In other words, St. Bonaventure won their debate, okay, and actually tossed out Aristotle, in effect.
Well, I think there's a different interpretation.
No. I'm not arguing that it was exactly the same, because your point about the Quranic scholars versus biblical interpretation is a very good one, I think, in that there was a culture, a religious culture, locked into an understanding of their text that was different than our understanding of our text. So where Bonaventure could make his argument, he knew full well that he could be wrong, and therefore, you know, Aquinas eventually could have his say. Where in the Muslim world, that wasn't possible. There was only one interpretation, as you said. So the move for modernization was put down very dramatically, I think. At least what I'm being told by Muslim scholars.
Okay, there is another question over there. Have you switched it off? Have you switched
Yes,
it off?
I did.
Manuel Jimenez.
Yeah. Thank you, Marty, for your insightful talk. Really, it was very interesting. Yesterday, during dinner, great dinner, incidentally.
It was a wonderful dinner, by the way. Thank you, James.
A lot of wine around and so on. James Lanoux was making a big statement. I asked him which are the best question, or the most important question in biology for the next few years, and he has two. To understand form, in the sense of Aristotelian form, and the second one, how the mind works. I would like to ask you the same question.
Well, I agree with him about the nature of mind. That, as David Chalmers has said, is the hard problem. And so the neurosciences are struggling right now with that, along with philosophers and theologians. I just did a conference in October at Claremont Theology called Neuroscience and Spiritual Practice, in which we literally confronted these two disciplines to try to see if there was anything of commonality. And we had the neuroscientists doing the functional MRIs, to changes and saying there's consciousness, and we had practitioners of centering prayer or Buddhist meditation saying no, that's not consciousness, you know. And it was a very interesting conference in the end. It's all online, by the way. All the presentations are videoed and online. I can get the URL for you. But it was clear in that we are still at that hard problem. We don't have commonality. We're not speaking the same language even. The neuroscientists and the practitioners are not talking about the same things at all. So I think that remains, as Chalmers said, the hard problem. For molecular biology, I think that the next leap is going to be to see what this change in, if I'm right, this change in philosophical orientation actually yields, if anything. If it remains simply a new way of expressing the ultimate materialist concept of everything is defined by the DNA and what it encodes, then I think we haven't got anywhere in terms of a philosophical shift. If, on the other hand, a move to emergent properties allows eventually an understanding that leaps beyond that. We did a conference that ultimately was a book called Evolution and Emergence by Steger and Murphy, where Phil Clayton actually challenged us that we remain with an ontological gap between the biological sciences as I've described them and anything that would be called metaphysical or theological. And until we can cross that gap, until we have something that, as you said, would be a platform or a bridge between those, we're still in the same morass that we've been in. So as a specific problem, it's hard to say. The genome goes ahead. Hap mapping and genome comparisons are the rage of the day. Massive data analysis of sets, all that is proceeding with tons of funding. But that's not really, to me, the essential question. The real question is how we interpret those data and what we make of that. So we still don't have the answer from biology. What does it mean to be human? Now, the two questions are related. Obviously, the neuroscience question and this one are related in the sense that we're trying to bridge this gap. And I think that's where I'm waiting for biology to go, to see what happens next. And in that is embedded the idea of returning form and maybe even purpose. I think excising formal cause and final cause from science worked fine for chemistry and physics. It does not work for biology. We too obviously see them. And it's impossible to ignore them other than to rename them something like teleonomy, you know, and pretend that we've done a service.
I just received permission to spend 10 more minutes on the discussion. So we have 2 more questions, one over there and then that's last one.
Yeah, actually, you just answered my question. I was going to ask you about the recovery of form, so I'll pass my microphone.
Thank you for your talk, which I found absolutely fascinating. I just wanted to ask, I mean, it's connected with the whole question of now what is the relevance of Aristotle, but I want to ask it more widely, because prior to, and it's linked in with something which is hinted at in the beginning of a work by E.F. Schumacher called Guide for the Perplexed. And it's interesting because the sort of the medieval paradigm is this notion. It looks at sort of the emanation, this sort of Neoplatonic idea of the emanation of degrees of being from the Godhead. So it's sort of from the top down. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting with Darwin, you've got the opposite. It's sort of going from the bottom up.
Bottom up.
So I'm wondering whether or not a new way of understanding this, and I suppose it links into the ideas of people like Simon Conway Morris, of a sort of biological anthropic principle,
yes,
whereby when the emanations coming down until they hit the sort of the material divide and material immaterial divide. Mm-hmm. But then you sort of have some way of preserving, nevertheless, this notion of emanation in terms of final causality, because of course final causality presupposes that there's something which these sort of biological entities are working towards, or which the whole sort of evolutionary program is working towards. And I wonder whether or not placing it within that wider metaphysical scheme might be a productive way of moving forward.
I think you're right. And in fact, my hope for the network science approach with emergent properties of these very large, complex networks, and understanding cells in that way, and understanding organisms, and ultimately populations, moves biology at least in orientation towards that kind of view. So at meetings, you now hear people talking about emergent properties and subvenience and all of these issues of top-down causality in some sense, although the mechanism is not clear, and the biologist will still argue that no, these are just material pieces of it that are interacting to give us this emergent property. No longer really willing to call it epiphenomenal, but at least not willing to call it much more than that. The philosophical approach then for people like Steger is to try to say that when we're looking at emergent properties of networks, we're actually looking at formal cause. That's where Bill would locate the return of formal cause to biology is in the network. So then the question becomes, what do you do with final causation? Where do you put that back in? And can you do that in science without sort of violating the ultimate boundary that people don't want to step on, right? That just raises hackles. As soon as you say you're being teleological, people, brace, and I'm not, kind of reaction. So we don't have a good sort of philosophical move there that gets us across that divide, but it's kind of like one step at a time here in recovering from reductionism. I don't think we can make it go full force all the way back to Aristotle, but we can at least get to formal cause maybe in this way.
One of the consequences of this would seem to be that we're moving to a much more personal view of the universe from the science-religion point of view.
Yeah, it would be. It would.
Suddenly personhood becomes a central explanatory, but potentially you can see that the chance of sort of notion of personhood actually becoming, especially if you see the whole physical world moving towards the emergence of a certain.
So here's my take on what's happened in the sciences, real quickly, and then perhaps I won't take. But if you take Thomas's fifth way, you remember that in that he says that things move toward an end as an archer shooting an arrow to a target. And my take is that what we've done in the sciences is we've focused our attention on the arrow. Okay, that's all we see. We can measure weight, height, the speed, action, but we have no way of measuring the archer or the target. And so in the sciences, we've looked at the arrow. That's all there is. An arrow moving through space in a purposeless way. That's Dawkins, right? Without realizing that there's an archer and a target. And we have no tools for measuring that. We've limited our tool selection to measuring the arrow itself. And until we can return to seeing that there are the other components of the picture, and either developing a way of scientifically approaching those, or at least allowing those disciplines, as Rob said, allowing them the space to talk about those within the context of science, we're going to have this totally incomplete picture of an arrow flying.
One last question for James.
Thanks, I enjoyed a lot your kind of history of biology. And as I said at the beginning of the conference, I was trained as a physicist, and that seems to be a species in extinction, especially since 1989, right? So since the end of the Cold War. And as you said, you know, someone comes to you saying, you got all the money of the world, so what are you going to do with it? I mean, previously physicists were given out the money of the world. Now, my question is, from the times of William Whewell, 19th century, right? The paradigm of science was physics, and here we're perhaps talking acritically about religion, because there's many religions. We're talking acritically about science because there's many ways of science and many methods of science. But in the story you explained, it looks as if biology is winning in the second half of the 20th century by also incorporating the model of physics. But by doing that, it's committing suicide. That's the way I understood your talk.
Yes.
So, am I right on that?
That's the conclusion that I would make. That we actually, by being seduced into that strictly reductionist view, wound up in this problem.
So I can tell my physicists friends that, well, they're not the losers, but they've managed to kill biology.
Exactly, they managed to kill biology. But actually, it was not done by physics, because if biology actually recognized modern physics, if biology actually took physics after its quantum revolution seriously, we would never have gotten into this problem either. And biology is stuck in Newtonian physics, to be honest. That's really the determinism that biology is sort of trapped in. It's a 19th century discipline trying to answer 21st century questions. And it doesn't recognize that physics has already gone through this change. When I give lectures like this about biology's problems to physicists, they look at me like I'm nuts. Like, you know, what? We don't think that way. You know, we're not doing that anymore. So we've failed to actually take under full account what physics really is now. So in that sense, if we had done it, I think we wouldn't be in these very kind of issues that I've described.